Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, dubious speculation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, it's already been a fairly interesting month for Bitcoin, with it pushing to $106,000. I believe the current all-time high is now around 106. 518. So we are certainly seeing some movement. And one of the things that I'd like to do in this video is just go through a lot of the different indicators, try to figure out where we are. Is this different than prior cycles? Is it more of the same? We'll take it from there. So the first thing is to sort of look on the weekly time frame. What is Bitcoin currently doing? And what's really interesting is that it continues to be almost a carbon copy of what happened last year, right? We talked about this a lot, where you basically get a move up early in the year, and then you get your summer lull, right? Where the market just kind of doesn't do a whole lot in the summer. And then sometime in Q3, Bitcoin continues its ascent, right? And so that's basically how the year played out, and you can see that it found sort of a local top right there in early January. And then we just repeated the whole thing again, right? Move up, down, and then up again. What's really fascinating is if you go over here and you look at year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin, you can better visualize it by just looking at 2023, the year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin in 2023, and comparing it to 2024, and seeing just how similar of a move it is, right? It's a very similar move when comparing 2023 to 2024. Now, there's also other similarities as well. For instance, if you were to go look at monthly returns by Bitcoin, you can see that in 2015 and in 2016, September through December were green. We haven't seen that since. The only time in history we've seen that for Bitcoin, where you had September through December as green. The only two times were in 2015 and in 2016. Until this cycle, where we saw the same thing in 2023 and 2024. In fact, the patterns within those months are somewhat similar as well. There are some slight differences, but like you can see that the September of 2015 was only about a 3% gain, and then double that the following year, and then in 2023 is about 4, and then almost double it the following year. So again, there's a lot of similarities to see there, even in October, right? 30% followed by 15. This was 29 followed by 11. So a lot of similarities there. And then furthermore, the other similarities that we've talked about are Trump becoming the president-elect, right? And the dollar rallying with the long end of the yield curve in Q4 of the halving year. So if you go look at Bitcoin, one of the things you'll note is that the dollar has also been rallying. And we've actually talked a lot about that. I mean, I said many times we would likely see the dollar rally after the first rate cut, which was right here. But I also said that that doesn't necessarily mean that Bitcoin has to go down, because in 2016, we saw the same thing where the dollar rallied starting here, right, in August. Well, it started earlier, but you can see there was a low in August and then another low in November, and it just kind of accelerated into the end of the year. And so the speculation was that, well, if the dollar is sort of bottoming out over here in September and it were to rally about 9 to 10% by the end of the year, that would put it between 109 to 110. The reason I got that number is because that's basically what the dollar did over here in 2016 from around that same time, right? September into the end of the year, it rallied about 10%. And here the same thing, right? Now, what's fascinating, of course, is back in 2016 when the dollar got that rally, Bitcoin also rallied, right? So you don't always, it's not true that just because the dollar goes up, Bitcoin has to go down. In fact, there are times where they move together. 2016 Q4 was one of those times. Now you're seeing the same thing play out here in Q4 of 2024. So certainly a lot of similarities to sort of make between those two. I'd also like to draw your attention to the monthly RSI of Bitcoin. And there's this like parallel channel that you can draw. And then you can kind of identify sort of the lower highs on the monthly RSI. And actually, just because you tag the trend line doesn't even mean the cycle has to be over. For instance, in 2013, the monthly RSI tagged the trend line a couple of times. You can see in 2011, it tagged it a couple of times. In 2017, it tagged it a couple of times. Last cycle, it only tagged it once, but the price of Bitcoin did go higher after that, right? It went higher here, even though it was a lower high on the monthly RSI. And sort of the other way to look at it is actually on the 2-week RSI. Now, the 2-week RSI is essentially what helped us to identify the quote unquote mid-cycle top back in March. If you look at the 2-week RSI, it looked to be fairly extended, right? It looked to be fairly extended at the time, sort of suggesting that, you know what, we might need to see a longer cool off period, more than just like a couple of weeks. That might take 6 to 9 months. It took about 7 to 8 months. But you can see that the 2-week RSI, when it tagged that trend line, that's ultimately where Bitcoin cooled off for about half a year. So I would keep that in mind as well. In 2013, you can see that it tagged the trend line a couple of times, like we were just talking about the monthly RSI tagging it a couple of times in prior cycles. You can see the 2-week RSI tagged it a couple of times in 2013, and this actually is playing out in a very similar fashion, right? If you think about it, right? If you look at the first top, and then it came down, and the first top occurred in April, right? In April, and then the low was in June, right? This time it was March to August. March to August. And then this was back up into November. So far, it's still going up, and we're currently in December. So I would certainly keep an eye on that as well if the 2-week RSI gets back up here. 2-week RSI is currently at around 78. So, if it were to get up to like 87 or so, that might be an area where the market might start to cool off again. But just keep that in mind. Like, the RSI is not really something that you should use to trade, in my opinion, but it should be used as confluence with other indicators, right? So, you have the year-to-date ROI. So you have monthly returns, 2023 and 2024, looking very similar to 2015 and 2016. You have the year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin still tracking 2023 for the most part, right? I mean, you can see that this is essentially what Bitcoin did last year as well, where it had this sort of final drop into August and September, and then it rallied on up at the end of the year. It looks like it's doing the same thing once again. If you were to actually look at prior halving years, which I'm sure a lot of you guys are interested in, here's the average of prior halving years. Now, if you just look at individual halving years, here's 2012, here is 2020, and here is 2016. So you can see Bitcoin's kind of right in between them. So what's really interesting is if you take the average of those prior halving years, you can see that Bitcoin is essentially tracking the average for at least the last month or so, last month and a half or so. It's been tracking it. Now, if it were to track it for the rest of the month, going into, say, early January, it would put it around 120K or so, if it's able to continue to track that. There's no guarantee that it does. It's possible that it just kind of does what 2023 did and sort of level out before it reaches that. In fact, the 2016 cycle, which seems to be the most comparable, we've actually exceeded those gains this year, right? So Bitcoin's gone up more in 2024 than it did in 2016. So that's also kind of an interesting little tidbit, that we've seen Bitcoin go up more in 2024 than 2016, despite the fact that the market cap of Bitcoin is quite a lot higher. So we've covered year-to-date ROI. We've covered monthly returns. We've covered the RSI. But what I'd like to do now is go over to the ROI from the bottom, right? So ROI after cycle bottom. And you can see that Bitcoin is kind of right in between where it was the last two cycles. So do keep that in mind. Now, it is true that last cycle, Bitcoin did get a correction around this point. And the cycle before that, the correction occurred a little bit later on. Now, I'd like to bring your attention to that idea. We've talked about it a few times, but there is some validity to the idea that Bitcoin experiences corrections in January of their post-halving years. That doesn't mean that the market has to go, only down in January. It just means that you can get corrections in January, as you saw in 2021. There was a 30% correction in January, and in 2017, there was a 30 to 40% correction in January. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be to a lower price than it is right now, but you can see that there were corrections in January of the post-halving years. And of course, they were preceded by a run-up into that level. In fact, if you look at sort of the weekly candles of Bitcoin right here, you can kind of see some similarities right there, right? This is November of 2024. This is November of 2016, right? So still some similarities in how these cycles are in fact playing out. Note is, as far as Bitcoin dominance goes, if Bitcoin were to accelerate to the upside, you would likely see Bitcoin dominance go back up in the short term. As long as, if Bitcoin kind of stalls out for a little bit, that's when dominance goes down. If Bitcoin continues to accelerate higher, then normally you would expect Bitcoin dominance to, in fact, go up. So there's a lot of different ways that you can look at the market. You can also measure the ROI of Bitcoin as measured from the peak, right? So if you measure it from the peak and go peak to peak, we're actually tracking last cycle the closest at the current time. If you isolate just this cycle and 2 cycles ago, the 2016 to 2017 cycle, it looks pretty similar, although this cycle is a little bit more elevated. But if you take April 2021 as the top instead of November, it looks even more closely related, to that other move, right? You even sort of get the bounces and the bottoms around the same time and the initial move up at the same time. Now, if this is the case, then it could mean we're further along than people think we are, right? It could mean we're on day 1343, and would imply we only have a little bit longer to go. Now, that doesn't have to be true, obviously, but it is something to keep in mind. We're going to follow this, obviously. You would want to see confluence with other indicators as well. Like you'd want to see confluence with, say, the risk metric, and sort of like the RSI stuff we looked at earlier. If you saw confluence among sort of an array of different indicators, that would probably provide some guidance. We'll probably do a video specifically on market cycle theory to sort of go through all that. If you look at ROI after the halving, you can actually see that this cycle is underperforming the last 2 cycles. So you see the last 2 cycles sort of had a correction coming up, and that might be sort of that January correction, which, I mean, I know January is only a couple of weeks away, but obviously a lot could happen between now and then. So I would also point your attention to other indicators like the there's another one that I wanted to sort of mention over here. Yeah, it's up here actually. It's the stablecoin supply ratio oscillator. If you look at that, you can kind of see sort of a similar trend where the initial spike is not the local top. The local top occurs as the SSRO sort of fades back down. Same thing here, right? The top wasn't there. The local top occurred as it faded back down. Even in 2023, right? The local tops occurred even after it faded back down. In late 2023, the same thing, right? This top, early 2024, didn't occur until after this spike as it sort of faded back down. And arguably, we're seeing something very similar again, where you get the major spike up by the stablecoin supply ratio oscillator, and then as it fades back down, the price of Bitcoin continues to slowly go up, just showing you a repeat of the pattern that we've continued to observe. So I do think that's an interesting indicator for sure. If we check in with the Bitcoin risk, it's currently 0.653. Again, if you guys want access to this, you can always check out the sale on ITC Premium. If you go look at the running 1-year ROI of Bitcoin, it's basically hovering right around 2. So there's a lot of ways that it looks similar to this cycle over here. Of course, if you connect the peaks, obviously you are getting diminished peaks. So you're probably not going to see an ROI of, say, 20x or 10x from 1 year to another. But that doesn't mean there's not upside, right? There's been plenty of upside, even if Bitcoin just keeps trending at just around 2x from the prior year. So certainly another interesting way to look at the market is to sort of view it through the lens of the running ROI. Now, going back to just the price of Bitcoin, one of the things to look at as well are the daily time frames, right? So if you look at like the daily time frames, what you'll notice is that there's kind of a lot of similarities between this year and last year, where you basically get a drop below the 200-day moving average in August, and we saw something very similar happen last year, right around the same time, and then you get this initial move up. So you could argue that like kind of this phase right there is the same thing that we saw like right here. Okay. Now, if it does accelerate higher, kind of like it did right there, if that's what's happening right now, then it could in fact just be sort of a repeat of what we saw in late 2020, where you get this consolidation for a little bit, but then Bitcoin takes back over. Now, the reason why that's important is if Bitcoin does continue this move higher, Bitcoin dominance could continue to slowly go up. That doesn't mean it has to put in a new cycle high, but you can see that dominance also dropped back over there in November of 2020, and then at the end of December, you can see that dominance shot up once again. And so you can already see kind of some similarities, right? There's a drop by dominance, but now it's starting to go back up again as Bitcoin is accelerating. So there's a lot of similarities. And I just think it's important to keep in mind. So I also obviously, it's at least worthwhile to sort of mention that there are other things going on in sort of the macroverse that are worth paying attention to. Obviously, we are in fact seeing the yield curve uninvert, and the lag time on that between when economic downturns happen can range from immediately to a year away, right? And then in fact there was one time in like 1967 where it was like 2 years later. So you have to remember that there can be lag times on that sort of stuff. But what you really like to see is sort of confluence amongst a lot of indicators to figure out, is it a market cycle top or is it a local top, right? And that's really kind of the difficult thing, as to there's obviously local tops along the way, but how do you actually identify the market cycle top? Now, what I've been looking at again is the risk metric, and that was one of the reasons why I didn't think that March was the market cycle top, was because the risk had only gone up to around 0.7 to 0.8. And normally market cycle tops make it to the 0.8 to 0.9 risk band at the very least. So that was at least one thing to consider back then as to why it likely wasn't a market cycle top. But it does just sort of remind you of where we are in the cycle. The other thing to keep in mind is the social risk, right? So the social risk is still around 0.3 to 0.4, still relatively low, all things considered. And for the people that want alt season to occur, you need to see retail come back aggressively, right? I know that sometimes it feels like it's like 2021, but the social risk kind of shows you that it's not, right? If this were like 2021, you would see Bitcoin dominance falling off a cliff, okay? But you don't see that right now. That doesn't mean you're not going to get it, but remember, normally alt seasons have occurred in post-halving years, not halving years. So that would correspond to next year, if in fact it's going to happen. So those are some views to just sort of express there about Bitcoin. Obviously, it's dubious speculation, and we do have a rate cut coming up this week by the Fed. I would have argued that if the Bank of Japan had raised rates, you'd probably get a correction. The Bank of Japan raised rates because the Bank of Japan is also meeting on the 18th. Right, everyone's gonna be looking at what the Fed's gonna do, but the Bank of Japan's probably more important. So when the Bank of Japan raised rates in March, Bitcoin then got a correction, right, the next month in April. And then when the Bank of Japan raised rates in July, Bitcoin got a correction in August. So the Bank of Japan is going to be meeting here in a couple of days, but market probabilities suggest that they're not going to raise rates, and that it could be deferred until either January or March. Now, if it were deferred toward January, it might line up with a typical January of the post-halving year correction. Furthermore, though, even if they do raise rates in December, it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to have an immediate correction. For instance, when they raised rates in July, earlier this year, the market didn't actually get the correction until August, right? So it wasn't even immediate when it even did happen. So even if they were to raise rates in December, you might not see the markets really reflect that until sometime in January. So I'd certainly keep that in mind. So a lot of stuff going on in the markets. Bitcoin's continuing to climb the wall of worry as the unemployment rate came in last week or a couple weeks ago at 4.2%. And I said that as long as it doesn't come in really above, I think I said what I said was if it comes in at 4 to 4.1, it's really bullish. If it comes in at 4.3 or higher, we'll probably get a correction. If it comes in at 4.2, it's more so neutral. But Bitcoin's continued to go up, and it kind of just reminds you that it doesn't need a reason to go up; it needs a reason to go down. So until you get a reason for it to really go down, the market just sort of slowly continues to go to the upside. So I would be watching the risk metrics. I'd watch sort of that monthly RSI, the 2-week RSI. Watch the stablecoin supply ratio oscillator. I would be mentally prepared for some type of a correction in January. And I will do another video soon where we talk about market cycle theory and we'll go through, sort of the different scenarios and, what's the most probable and at what point could we sort of lean towards one over another, right? I mean, at this point, everything is still up in the air, right? All these cycle theories for the most part are up in the air. You have left translated cycles, you have sort of the normal cycles, and so on and so forth. So we'll do another video on that. I don't want to make this one go too long. A lot of people have, in fact, requested shorter videos, so we're trying to keep this one not an hour like I tend to do, at other phases of the market cycle. But let's see where Bitcoin can go. And I'm just gonna keep looking at some of these other charts that we've been following for a while, and that's just look, guys, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And Bitcoin just continues to track basically what it did last year. For all the indicators out there telling you what was going to happen or the news stories, it's just doing the same thing it did last year. And in addition, it's also doing, at this point in the cycle, it's just tracking what it did during the average of the last 3 halving years, right? It's been tracking it almost perfectly for the last 5 or 6 weeks. So I hope these videos are useful to you guys. Just trying to keep everything, trying to stay on track with the cycle and figure out where we are and what are the most likely outcomes. But I think one of the reasons that you get corrections in January is because there's uncertainty associated with changes in administrations with the U.S. president. That doesn't mean that Bitcoin can't go higher after that, but I think you will get, and this time, what it could be is Bitcoin gets a correction after the inauguration or sometime just to sort of figure out, all right, are we actually going to get a strategic reserve? And if we do, then Bitcoin will likely just continue higher. If we don't, obviously that could set the stage for, a larger correction. But that's where I think we are in the cycle right now. And let's just see if it continues to be a carbon copy of what happened last year. Now, again, what happened last year is that, Bitcoin did sort of slowly go up, then it accelerated into December, and then it kind of stalled out until January, where it had that correction in January, and then in February, it continued. But you can see that it also had a correction in January. So I would be on the lookout for that sometime in about, say, 3 to 4 weeks. But obviously a lot can happen between now and then with Bitcoin. And if hopefully Bitcoin can just continue tracking the prior years where it goes up sort of at the end of the year. And this is why I've mentioned before that the cyclical view is extremely compelling. It's a very strong view. And unless you have a reason to fade it, you're probably better off not fading it. Okay. I actually disagree with most forms of technical analysis, even though I try my hand at it at times. But really, what you want to focus on is just sort of momentum, right? Momentum usually precedes, just the continued momentum, and you need sort of a reason to get those corrections. So we'll see if we can see something like that happen this cycle as well. And then hopefully the next video I do will be sort of a more complete view about market cycle theories and sort of going through all the different theories so we can try to best figure out where in the cycle are we. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.